In Essential Task 2.1, we are going to begin our transition into our second unit. This first essential task in Unit 2 is going to feel a little bit disjointed from the rest of the unit, but I promise as we transition into the rest of the unit, it will make sense why we started here with Essential Task 2.1. We are going to first begin by tracing the growth of psychology, identifying some of the early phases of psychology, some of the early approaches to psychology, and then transitioning into sort of the more modern approach to psychology, which is going to really embrace the scientific method, a topic you very likely studied in previous science classes. I recommend a horizontal concept map for this essential task. This essential task involves the three boxes you see here on the left, underneath the pre-scientific method. And then on the right, it looks like it's a rather long series of boxes, but that bottom box there in the bottom right corner kind of has a giant picture in the middle of it, so it's not quite as long as it might indicate. But our goal today is to sort of track the growth of psychology, talking about some of the early pre-scientific method approaches, and then talking about some of the important details regarding sort of this modern approach to psychology, where we will be identifying some of the ethical guidelines that are going to drive the approaches that we describe in the remaining essential tasks in Unit 2. We are going to begin our concept map by zooming into the growth of psychology boxes. We have on the left the heading pre-scientific method, and on the right we have post-scientific method. This box has a history of psychology icon in the top right corner. Prior to 1879, psychology was considered basically the same as philosophy. A topic, certainly one with a lot of discussion, a lot of debate, but one that was not incredibly scientific. You might talk about the mind the same way that you talked about morals or ethics. However, after 1879, we saw a major transition, which is why this box warrants a history of psychology icon, where Wilhelm Wundt conducted some of the very first psychological studies under experimental conditions. This unit will be talking in great depth about research, but in order to do that, it's worth accrediting Wundt for some of the early work that tried to transition psychology from the equivalent of philosophy to what we see today, which is an incredibly scientific study. Psychology, by definition, is the scientific study of mental processes or cognition, our Unit 1 topic, and then behavior, something which we'll be talking about throughout the entirety of the year. And in many ways, Wundt is the individual that transitioned us from just debating about the mind to some of the real scientific approaches that we're going to talk about over the course of this unit and really throughout the rest of the year. As a mnemonic, when I look at Wundt's last name, the WN kind of sounds like the number 1, depending on how you want to pronounce it. He is, for all intents and purposes, the real first scientific psychologist. So we'll give him credit, Wun or Wun for 1, and consider him the first psychologist. We're going to transition and talk about 2 of the early schools of psychology. Neither of these are particularly influential in a modern context. Neither of them are practiced really in any capacity. However, it's important to understand where psychology began in order to track some of the progressions, which we'll talk about as the course progresses. Structuralism gets a history icon in the top right corner. Edward Bradford Titchener, the founder of structuralism, gets a contributing psychologist icon. Again, meaning it's a name, it's important, but it's not an overwhelmingly important AP Psych all-star. Structuralism was one of the early schools of thought, and it utilized a process of introspection in order to try and study what Titchener called the structure of the mind, which essentially was trying to identify some type of consistent reactions when presented with stimuli. The process of introspection is actually a concept that you might encounter in a modern context, but Titchener approached introspection like this. Now, he would present his participants or the individuals with whom he was working with certain types of stimuli, whether that's a song or a picture or some type of smell, and would ask them to sort of self-evaluate their reaction and then categorize their reaction. Titchener was trying to find out whether or not the mind was essentially pre-programmed to react a certain way to certain inner stimuli in our environment. Again, whether that's music or a picture or a smell, hoping to try and sort of fundamentally put together piece by piece the structure of the mind with these consistent reactions. The problem with structuralism and the problem with introspection really is quite obvious. It's that each individual person might react a certain way to a different stimuli, and as a result, there wasn't quite as many consistencies between participants as Titchener really would have wanted. So typically, we demonstrate this in class, where each individual student would be presenting fellow classmates with different sounds and then trying to track them and trying to find some types of consistencies. Obviously, circumstances warrants a different approach, but this is typically something that we do demo. Opposing structuralism is what we call functionalism. It's the second early school of psychology, and again, it's not one that has much of an important modern application, but nevertheless, in order to understand the history of early psychology, it's important to differentiate these two. Functionalism gets a history of psychology icon in the top right corner, and William James, the founder of functionalism, gets a contributing psychologist icon. James began asking the types of questions which would lead future psychologists into the direction of the fields of study that we actually see today, ones like behavioral psychology and cognitive psychology. James began to ask, I don't care if this is how we react. Why is it that we react certain ways? And what is the benefit to our reactions? So instead of saying, what happens when you smell this rose, James might question, well, why is it that we react a certain way when we hear something or see something? He began to question the functions of our behavior, which is important because, as I alluded to a moment ago, that type of question would inspire future psychologists to approach the field of psych from a variety of different perspectives. The other important thing about James, and it's actually somewhat trivial, is that while working as a professor, he tutored Mary Whiton Calkins, who wasn't able to actually enroll in college due to gender discrimination at the time. But Whiton Calkins would still work with James hand in hand in the early days of functionalism. And then she went on to become the first female president of the American Psychological Association, the APA. Whiton Calkins is another name that we need to potentially know in the AP exam, although her contribution is in and of itself quite important. She's going to get a contributing psychologist icon just because it's not overwhelmingly likely that she appears on the AP exam, which is what usually dictates what type of symbol each name receives. Those are some of the early schools of thought. Again, neither of them really influence modern psychology in any great, significant way. So we're going to transition away from that and talk more about where we are today. We approach psychology from a scientific perspective. We use the scientific method, what you likely learned in an earlier science class, where you develop a hypothesis and you go through rigorous testing and you go back and develop the steps. Psychology today in a modern context, very much scientific. It's important to identify a couple different organizations and a couple different steps involved in conducting research, which is going to be the major topic of this unit. The APA, or the American Psychological Association, is the largest professional organization of psychologists. I actually get asked all the time if I want to, pay some fees and join. I haven't up until this point, but it's actually something I've considered before. The APA is important for a few different reasons. One is that typically the APA can sort of lead the field in certain directions, or publish work, spotlight significant findings, spotlight certain psychologists. Additionally, the APA is constantly working to revamp ethical standards. We'll be talking a little bit about ethical standards in just a moment. Or the Institutional Review Board, which can be a secondary example of what we consider organizations that focus on ethical standards. We're going to be talking a lot about in the next slide some of the expectations and standards that are necessary in order to actually conduct research and have that research be approved. If you know anybody that works in research, whether that's in terms of surveys, whether that's in terms of medical interventions, most, if not everything, needs to be approved by the IRB, which is what the Institutional Review Board stands for. And the IRB is going to apply ethical guidelines, either developed in some capacity or with guidance by the APA or by any other type of psychological association. There's two other bits of somewhat trivial things to note here. The AP exam has quite a few different names that you could potentially need to know. And sometimes those names, again, are not super overwhelming. And in this case, we're just going to kind of throw a couple names in here. Hopefully they are encoded and stick in long-term memory. If not, they should get contributing psychologist icons anyway, which means they're not overwhelmingly important. Neither of them have that, but you should put the small letter C if you've been using those symbols. The first president of the APA is a gentleman by the name of G. Stanley Hall. I use the mnemonic, the original G, Stanley Hall. That way you can identify him as the first. He is the original and first president of the APA. And then, although Margaret Floy Washburn was not the first female president of the APA, that was Mary Whiton Calkins. She is the first female to ever receive a PhD in psychology, which is a pretty significant historical event due to the gender discrimination that occurred in education at the time. So Margaret Floy Washburn, when I look at her name, I see the F and the W in the Floy and the Washburn, and I think of first woman with a PhD. So a couple small names in this essential task. We have Mary Whiton Calkins, we have Hall, we have Washburn, and then previous to that we had Titchener and James. Luckily, there are no more names in this unit. They're all kind of small, less likely, somewhat trivial names, but nevertheless, we still need to talk about them at least briefly. Moving on to the final box in this essential task, and again, it's not quite as long as it looks because there's a giant picture here. But we're going to identify some, not all, but some of the ethical guidelines that dictate what you can and cannot do when you conduct psychological research. At the very top here, the heading of this box simply says APA Ethical Guidelines, and then it jumps down here to where it says Highlights. I'm going to identify some, not all, but some of the ethical guidelines that we need to follow in order to actually conduct research. The very first ethical guideline is what we call informed consent, which means it's critical to describe the research that you will be conducting to your participants prior to the research being conducted. So before your experiment, before your survey, before whatever it is that you're conducting is actually run, you need to describe the type of research that you'll be running and get their approval. So a participant needs to approve, they need to provide consent that they are willing to participate in the study. What's really important here, though, is depending on the type of research that you are conducting, you are actually allowed to lie to your participants. You're allowed to use deception, but there are very specific criteria in order to actually use deception. In order to use deception, it needs to be blatantly clear and obvious, and this needs to be approved by the IRB, that there's no other possible way to conduct your research, and that your research offers significant scientific value. If you do not meet that criteria, you will not be able to deceive anyone in your research. However, once you have proven that deception is critically necessary to conduct your research and that it is beneficial to the scientific community and to the world as a whole, then you are allowed to deceive, which makes this informed consent part especially important, because even though you are going to lie to your participants as a byproduct of your research, you still need to give them the gist, a general idea of what they're getting themselves into. You never want a subject to walk into research having no idea what's going on, not having consented to it. That's highly, highly unethical. So even if you do plan on deceiving them, they still need to have at least a general idea of what's going on. And an example of deception is this. If a participant thinks that they're going to be part of a memory study, but it actually ends up being a study of what happens when you're in the room with 5 people as opposed to 3, and in either circumstance, they're going to sit in a room and do a memory task. If you tell them they're going to do a memory task, although at the heart of the study, you're evaluating their reactions to other people, they still at least have a general idea of what's going on. Yes, you are lying to them, but you're not lying in this overwhelmingly harmful way. They're still doing something related to memory, at least in the context of what they agreed to. It's not overwhelming. That's a good example where you got informed consent, the IRB likely approved the deception, you still told them the gist of what you're doing, and now you can conduct your study. This isn't going to receive any type of definition because it's simply what it sounds like, but it's important to maintain confidentiality. If you do not get direct approval from your participants to use their name or any type of autobiographical information that can identify them, then you simply can't publish that information. So you wouldn't, for example, publish your results at the end of a study with just a list of all your participants' names. You would need to get that approval ahead of time. The other very important thing to do is implement what's called debriefing, which is to explain the purpose of your study to your participants after it is done, which in many cases requires follow-up, even days, weeks, months after the research was originally conducted. So you might have participants come into your lab. Well, you need to follow up with those participants once you publish your work, once you've done all your research, once you've written your paper, once you've been published in a journal, so that it's fully made clear to those participants what their contributions ended up resulting in. And it's important here, particularly if you used any type of deception, meaning if you planned on lying to your participants, you lied to your participants at the very end of your study, you need to inform them that you lied to them, you need to explain why you lied to them, and you need to really answer any questions that they might have. Some participants might be really upset that you were lying to them. And as a result, the debriefing process is critical in ensuring that they can walk out of your study without any type of physical or mental harm. And if for whatever reason they do in fact walk out of your study with physical or mental harm, you need to make sure everything is right. You need to follow up with those participants and work with them to ensure that you alleviate any type of further distress. Additionally, participants have the right to withdraw at any time. This isn't directly listed as one of the bullets, meaning that at any point a participant might decide, I am no longer comfortable. I gave you informed consent, but I no longer feel comfortable with the study and I'd like to walk out. Under that circumstance, they have the right to withdraw at any point, and then you would follow up and debrief them. So no matter what, regardless of whether or not the study went to conclusion or a participant withdrew from the study, it's critically important in order to use the debriefing process. Other ethical issues involve, obviously we're not going to intentionally harm someone. If an animal needs to be harmed, we need to do it in as humane of a way as possible.